Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into the world of civil rights movements?
Always ready for a good deep dive.
Me too. Especially with a source like Lessons from History, The Fight for Civil Rights, there's always something new to learn.
Definitely. It's not just about remembering dates and names, though, right?
Right, we're looking at the bigger picture, the patterns, the long-lasting impact these movements have had.
Yeah, you see these recurring themes pop up again and again: discrimination, people raising their voices to advocate for change, the constant push for a better society.
Okay, so to start, what exactly are we talking about when we say civil rights movements? It's not just about achieving equal rights, is it?
It's so much more than that. Think about it as a continuous struggle against deeply rooted systems that hold people back, systems of oppression that need to be dismantled.
And the goal?
A society where everyone has a real shot, a genuine opportunity to thrive. Imagine a world where things like access to good schools and health care are just a given, not determined by the color of your skin or where you come from.
It makes you think, what would the world look like if everyone truly had those opportunities? To really appreciate these movements, we need to go back in time, right?
Absolutely. History gives us context, perspective.
Okay, let's start with the abolition of slavery back in the 19th century. That had to be a game changer.
Or
Right?
the huge, the 13th Amendment, a huge achievement. But it didn't magically erase the prejudice and inequality baked into American society for centuries.
And that's where those Jim Crow laws came in, right? I mean,
Right.
talk about a system designed to hold people back.
Exactly. It was a deliberate attempt to keep things unequal, especially in the South.
It's almost hard to believe how specific those laws were. I mean, they segregated everything, from schools and restaurants to public transportation and even restrooms.
It shows you just how deeply rooted those systems of oppression were. It wasn't enough to just outlaw slavery. You had to challenge the whole system.
It makes you realize the courage it took to stand up and fight for change. Which brings us to the amazing wave of activism that swept the nation in the mid-20th century. Individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, their names are iconic. But there's so much more to the story than just those names, isn't there?
You're right. It's the interplay between those powerful figures and the collective action, the movements they helped ignite. Think of Rosa Parks.
That moment on the bus, refusing to give up her seat, such a powerful act of defiance.
Exactly. And that single act sparked something incredible: the Montgomery bus boycott. And it wasn't just a few days. This boycott went on for 381 days.
Wow, 381 days. Talk about commitment. An entire community standing strong for almost a whole year. Did the boycott achieve anything beyond desegregating the buses?
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge turning point for the whole civil rights movement, showing the world the power of nonviolent resistance. Plus, it brought attention to figures like Joanne Robinson, who was instrumental in organizing the boycott behind the scenes.
It's always fascinating to learn about those behind-the-scenes heroes. We often focus on the famous names, but there were so many individuals working tirelessly, contributing in their own ways.
That's why it's so important to dig deeper. These movements weren't just about a few charismatic leaders. They were fueled by countless individuals. Think about Dr. King. We know him for his dedication to nonviolent resistance.
It's hard to imagine him being anything but a leader.
Well, even he initially hesitated to step into that leadership role. The weight of an entire movement's expectations on his shoulders, especially at such a young age, must have been immense.
It's interesting to think about these iconic figures as real people, wrestling with doubts and facing those internal struggles.
Exactly. Each of these leaders, including Malcolm X, who advocated for a different path, brought their own unique perspectives to the fight. Their styles, sometimes clashing, sometimes aligning, contributed to the tapestry of the movement.
Speaking of different styles, Malcolm X wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, to voice the anger and frustration felt by many in the Black community. It was a stark contrast to Dr. King's approach, wasn't it?
His fiery speeches, his unwavering belief in self-determination, it resonated with those who felt like progress through nonviolent resistance was just too slow. But what's really interesting is how his views evolved later in life. He started to move toward a more inclusive vision, one that emphasized unity and understanding, adding another layer of complexity to his legacy.
So even within the movement, there were different schools of thought, different ways of approaching the fight for equality, but all ultimately pushing for the same goal.
And that's what makes studying these movements so fascinating. It's about recognizing the variety of voices and strategies that shaped the course of history. It brings us to those pivotal events that captured the nation's attention, forcing everyone to confront the deep-seated injustices that needed to be addressed. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were moments that demanded real change.
We were talking about those moments that demanded real change, the kind that forces a nation to look in the mirror.
Absolutely. And the Selma to Montgomery marches were a prime example.
They weren't just about voting rights, were they?
No, they exposed the brutal reality of how far some would go to maintain a system built on inequality.
Bloody Sunday. Those images of peaceful protesters being attacked, it's hard to believe that happened in our country.
It was a turning point, a moment that really galvanized public support for the Voting Rights Act.
It reminds us that progress doesn't come easy. Those marchers weren't just asking for rights, they were challenging a whole way of life, a system that resisted change at every turn.
And they paved the way for that monumental victory, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It aimed to finally remove the obstacles that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote.
But even with legislation like that, the fight wasn't over, right? I mean, passing a law is one thing, but making sure it actually works, that's a whole different story.
You got it. It takes more than just words on paper. Think about what it took to enforce those laws, especially in places where resistance was so deeply ingrained.
And that's where the concept of intersectionality comes into play, doesn't it? It goes beyond just a black and white issue.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone's experiences are shaped by multiple layers of identity.
Can you give me an example? It's a bit of a complex idea, isn't it?
Imagine a black woman in the 1960s. She's facing not just racism, but sexism, too. Her struggle is unique because it's at the intersection of both of those identities.
Okay, so it's recognizing that people experience discrimination in different ways, depending on their race, gender, class, all those factors combined.
You got it. And even though the civil rights movement was largely focused on racial equality, it wasn't immune to these complexities.
So whose voices were sometimes missing from the narrative? You mentioned women, for example.
Absolutely. Women played such a critical role in the movement, organizing, mobilizing, strategizing, yet their contributions often get overshadowed. Think about Ella Baker.
I admit, I'm not familiar with her work.
She was a force, a brilliant strategist who believed in grassroots organizing, empowering communities to lead their own fight for justice.
And who else?
Fannie Lou Hamer, for example. Her testimony at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, it was powerful. It exposed the harsh reality of voter suppression in Mississippi.
These women were facing multiple forms of discrimination, yet they were at the forefront, fighting not only for themselves, but lifting up others too.
And it wasn't just about race and gender either. The movement also had to grapple with issues of sexual orientation. Bayard Rustin, a key figure in organizing the March on Washington, was openly gay.
But his contributions were often downplayed because of his sexual orientation.
Sadly, yes. It goes to show you that even within a movement fighting for equality, there were internal struggles and biases to overcome.
So how do we keep the momentum going, make sure those lessons from the past aren't forgotten? How do we learn from history and build a future where everyone has a fair shot?
It starts with understanding that the fight for civil rights isn't something that ended in the 1960s. It's still happening today. Issues like police brutality, systemic racism, voter suppression, these are all part of the ongoing struggle.
It feels like some of the battles we thought were won are being fought all over again.
It's a reminder that progress isn't a straight line. There will be setbacks. There will be moments where it feels like we're going backward. But we can't give up.
So looking back, were there any strategies or tactics that stood out as particularly effective? You mentioned Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance.
It was incredibly effective in galvanizing support and exposing the brutality of segregation.
But were there times when different approaches were needed?
Absolutely. There were debates and tensions within the movement. Some, like Malcolm X, argued that self-defense and Black empowerment were necessary, especially when faced with violence.
So there wasn't just one way of thinking?
No way. It was a diverse movement full of different perspectives, sometimes clashing over the best path to equality.
But all ultimately united by the same goal.
Exactly. And it's those differing opinions, those internal debates, that push the movement forward.
It makes you realize that social movements are dynamic, always evolving, shaped by all those different voices and experiences.
And let's not forget the economic dimension of the civil rights movement.
Right. It wasn't just about ending segregation and discrimination. It was about creating economic opportunities as well.
Absolutely. They demanded fair wages, access to quality education and job training, and an end to practices that kept Black Americans trapped in cycles of poverty.
True equality means having a real chance to succeed.
Exactly. And this is where that idea of intersectionality comes back in. You can't address economic inequality without understanding how race, class, and gender all intersect to create barriers that need to be dismantled.
It sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach, tackling these issues from every angle.
You got it. We have to address the systems and structures that perpetuate inequality, whether it's in education, housing, healthcare, or the criminal justice system.
And that brings us back to the power of education, right? Not just formal schooling, but raising awareness, building empathy, giving people the tools to fight for change.
You're absolutely right. Education is key. It helps us understand the historical context, recognize the ongoing challenges, and empower individuals to become agents of change.
But it can't just be about reading textbooks, right?
No way. It's about engaging with different viewpoints, listening to personal stories, confronting our own biases.
And being an ally, standing up for what's right, even when it doesn't directly affect us.
Exactly. And allyship is more than just words. It's about taking action, amplifying marginalized voices, and holding those in power accountable.
So how do we put those ideas into practice? How do we make our voices heard?
Think about your sphere of influence. It can be your workplace, your community, your family, even your social media. Challenge discriminatory language, advocate for inclusive policies, and support organizations working on the front lines.
It's like creating a ripple effect, starting small and building outward. And of course, there's the power of voting.
Absolutely. Participating in the democratic process is crucial. It's about making our voices heard and choosing leaders who will champion justice and equality.
So it's a combination of individual actions, collective efforts, pushing for systemic change, and never stopping learning and growing, challenging injustice wherever we see it.
You've got it. It's an ongoing journey, but every step we take, every conversation we have, brings us closer to a more just and equitable world.
It's incredible to think about how much ground we've covered, from individual acts of courage to those massive movements that reshaped the country. It really makes you think, what's my role in all of this? We've talked about the power of collective action, but what about individual responsibility? What can we do as individuals to make a difference?
It's a big question, and it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed. But here's the thing. Even small actions, they can create ripples,
So where do we even begin? What are some things we can actually do in our own lives?
It starts with education, really taking the time to understand these issues, not just skimming the surface, digging deep into the history, the systemic inequalities that are still present today.
Right. Knowledge is power. But it can't just be about reading books and articles, can it?
Nope. It's about actively engaging with that information, challenging our own biases, and those conversations that might be uncomfortable, those are the ones we need to have.
Stepping outside of our comfort zones, listening to people whose experiences are different from our own.
Exactly. It's about seeking out diverse perspectives, hearing those stories firsthand, and engaging in those tough conversations with people who might see things differently.
So being an ally means more than just saying the right words.
Right. It's about action. Using your voice to amplify the voices of those who are often silenced, speaking up when you see injustice, holding those in power accountable.
But how do we actually do that? How do we make our voices heard in a way that creates real change?
Think about where you have influence. It might be at work, in your community, your family, even online. Challenge those little comments, those offhand remarks that perpetuate discrimination. Advocate for policies and practices that are truly inclusive.
It's about creating a ripple effect, starting small and letting it spread outward.
Exactly. And don't forget about supporting those organizations that are already on the front lines. You know the ones doing the work day in and day out, whether you donate, volunteer your time, or just spread the word about what they do.
And of course, there's the power of voting. That's something we can all do to make our voices heard.
Right. Participating in the democratic process is essential. It's about making our voices heard and choosing leaders who are committed to justice and equality.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. Individual actions, collective efforts, systemic change, and always learning, always challenging ourselves, always pushing for a better world. It feels like a lot.
It is a lot, yeah. But every step, every conversation, every act of courage, no matter how small, it contributes to the bigger picture.
Wow, this deep dive has been an eye-opener. It makes you realize there's always more to learn, more to do.
Definitely. I'd encourage everyone to check out that article we mentioned, Lessons from History, The Fight for Civil Rights. It's packed with insights that can really guide us.
It's a good reminder that these movements, these struggles, they're not just about the past. They're about where we are today and what kind of future we're building. So before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a thought. How can you contribute to creating a more just and equitable world? What steps, big or small, can you take today to make a difference?
Remember, the fight for justice isn't a solo mission. It's a collective effort. Every voice matters, every action counts. Let's keep learning, challenging the status quo, speaking up for what's right, and working together to build a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep those conversations going, keep pushing for change, and we'll see you next time.